I think it's time for a spa day. I've had this Make It Mini spa kit sitting in my pile of possible projects for a while now, and I thought we might just crack it open and see what we get, and maybe make some sort of scale bathtub to go with it. Maybe a chance to do a resin pour, and I'm sure we'll find some way to work lights into it. I'm Sayer, and this is Witch Cove Crafts. As you may have guessed from last week's video, this episode was not quite the relaxing spa day I had originally planned for it to be. But sometimes the best stuff just works out that way. As a result of all the extra time this took, this is actually a craft you can build along with me at home if you have your own 3D printer. Check out a description for the link to the project files, which you can download for free right now. Before we can actually build anything, we need to figure out what our Miniverse kit is. It looks like we've got some bath bombs, which includes these cute little decor items. Let's craft ourselves some very tiny bath bombs. While they set, we can find some reference to inspire us. I'm thinking a little Japanese bathtub will be perfect, which you already know from the thumbnail, of course. So let's head over to Blender now. First, we're going to block out the major shapes of the diorama. Once the proportions feel good, we can move on to hashing out the details, like a little faucet on the wall, a window on the back, some planks along the wall, some candles, and a more refined shape for the tub. And then, after dropping some simple colors on the shapes to get a feel for the final result, we can really dive into the final details. We're also going to take the time to cut some wire guides into the mesh now, to save time and energy later on when we do the lights. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do for the lights at this point, but it's always easier to give ourselves extra room to work with up front, even if we don't need it later. Finally, we can add some pegs and holes to the different parts, and a drain for the tub. Now this would probably be plenty to print with, but we can take it a little further with some sculpting. Blender can actually do this just fine, but I'm going to use ZBrush here since that's what I'm honestly more familiar with. But don't use ZBrush. I actually have the last version that they released before switching to the god's-awful subscription approach that everything seems to be on these days. There are a lot of things that make sense for a subscription. ZBrush is not one of them. If you're looking for voxel-based alternatives, try 3D Coat. I've heard good things about it, and for now at least, the subscription is completely optional there. But back in ZBrush, I'll use a combination of textured tools and a fine detail tool to go over everything with textures and weathering and dial in some exaggerated wood grain effects. I can also quickly notch in some extra detail here and there that would have taken too long to do in the mesh stage. And when it's all done, we can send it over to the Cheeto box to slice and print. Cheeto box? I'm just realizing now I've never actually heard that word out loud. I'm assuming Cheeto box is correct. While it's printing, we can do the same for the rest of the pieces. Weathering, sculpting, and texturing everything one piece at a time before prepping each one for final printing. When prepping files for printing, it's always a good idea to remesh the final result to ensure it's a single cohesive mesh. You don't want things intersecting with themselves. Blender's Boolean operation is pretty good for this, but it is a little slow on complicated models. But the results will be absolutely perfect. But in the meantime, our tub is finished, primed, and ready to paint. Starting with a white zenithal layer, we want to gradually build that up in a few passes. This will really help to sell the scale and make the texture pop at the very end, by ensuring the deeper parts stay just a little bit darker. After that, we can glaze on some thin coats of brown and tan, followed by an ink wash, and then finally, just a few hand-painted details on the key textures in the drain. After applying a quick clear coat outside, which is going to seal in the paint and keep it from leaching into the resin, we'll be ready to prep the resin pour. For this step, we're going to use a couple clear sheets of craft acrylic from the hobby store. I'll link some options in the episode supply list, but honestly, just check your local craft store if you have one. They almost definitely have some, and it's almost definitely cheaper. For sheets this thin, they can be cut to size by just gently scoring them a few times with a fresh hobby knife, and then snapped cleanly at the score mark. To adhere the sheets to the model, we'll use a thin bead of silicone caulk from the hardware store. Keep it thin and apply as far away from the inside of the tub as possible. This will give it room to spread to the very edge without pouring over into the tub. If for some reason it does spill over, just use a sharp knife to cut away the excess after it's cured. Once the silicone has had a day or so to set, it's time to measure out the resin. As always, for a project like this, we want to use the slowest curing deep pore resin that we can find. This gives it time to degas without a vacuum chamber on hand, which will reduce bubbles in the final project. And since resin gives off heat as it cures, slow curing resin means that it produces less heat, which really reduces the chance of warping the mold. When measuring your resin parts, make sure to double check your instructions. Some resins are designed to be measured by weight, and some by volume. Always scrape the edges of your mixing and measuring cups when mixing. Make sure to leave nothing unmixed. Once it's been thoroughly mixed, which will genuinely take several minutes, you'll see the resin turn from clear to kind of a shimmery, cloudy effect, and then back to clear again once it's ready. We can pour it carefully into the mold and pop the bubbles with a torch as they rise to the surface over the next hour or so. And with that set aside to cure, now we can focus on the rest of the diorama. First, we'll need to do a little cleanup on the parts as they come out of the printer. A hobby knife works great to scrape off any nubs or marks left behind by the printing supports, but sometimes a Dremel with a grinding attachment is the best way to do it. And then after taking everything outside to prime again, we can dive into the painting. For the stone, let's stipple on some grays in various tones to build up textures. Don't just use a flat gray. Mix in a drop of red here, a little bit of green there to vary it and add some life to the stone. Real stone is rarely flat. Once it's looking good, a fine runner brush works well to go back between the stones and brighten up the mortar with some very light gray. This you do actually want to be a pretty flat color. It's an artificial mixture, so it shouldn't be nearly as varied as the stone is. Then we can use a little glue to pop the faucet in place, and some bronze and copper paints to make it shine, and finish off this part of the diorama. And finally, we can repeat the same stippling approach that we used for the wall on the little bit of floor that will be visible around the tub. Next, let's clean up and prime the back wall. Same as before, start with a zenithal highlight coat, keeping in mind that the lower half of the wall will be behind the tub and thus substantially darker, then thin layers of browns to build up the wood. As always, vary your browns a little bit, so they aren't completely flat. This is what a wet palette is for. Or in the case of an airbrush, just don't clean out your previous color completely as you mix in the next one. It helps give everything a natural variation. After the base colors dry, we can use some warm washes to make the textures pop. And then finally a light coat for the plaster walls. Once everything has dried, we can clean it up with a little extra brushwork along the edges, and it's ready to go. Then it's time to move on to the candles. We want to make these light up, so we're going to add lights to them. That's why I hollowed out the core of the model and printed them in clear resin. This means we can pretty easily pop some LEDs in there and run wires at the base. But the candles need to sit somewhere, which means it's finally time to actually make use of this little tray that came with the bath bombs. Since the diorama is a cutaway, we'll need to cut away this to match, and draw out space to run the wires through the slats freely. Finally, the resin cure is set, so we can peel away the silicone clock and pry off the mold. After the anxiety of hoping it didn't leak anywhere, this is always so satisfying. Then we can clean up the resin flashing with a hobby knife. Make sure it has a fresh blade before you do this. They're disposable for a reason. To simulate some ripples on the tub and make it feel freshly filled, we can use some water effects from Woodland Scenics, stippled on and swished around with a brush. A few spritzes of isopropyl alcohol, thinned with water, is enough to melt the effects goo just a bit and help it slump into a softer, more ripple-like texture. And finally, we can paint the candles. These are actually primed in 2 layers. First, a silver coat to reflect the light back and keep the flames nice and bright, and then a white top coat. After painting up the tray, we can route the candle cables through the slats and glue everything into one piece, and then pin the tray to the side of the tub with a little piece of paper clip drilled into the supports. And finally, we can wire all the lights together so we only have to run one set of wires over the edge of the tub. Now let's get this all put together. Remember those wire channels we put in the wall? I think we can actually make use of them. A little baking parchment paper cut to size will make for the perfect paper screen in the window, and we can tack it in place with just a little bit of super glue. Then we can put some LED filaments just outside of view of the main frame of the window, and the parchment should diffuse their light pretty nicely. Remember to be careful with these when soldering on wires. They're super fragile and they snap very easily. A little superglue gel combined with CA accelerator is plenty to tack them and the wires in place once they're done. Originally, I was going to power this with a button cell, but with this many lights I think I'd rather have it on wall power, so I'll cut a quick hole for a USB-C port with a router bit for my Dremel. Special note, if you're using these simple USB-C ports to power your projects, remember that they will not work with USB-C to C cables. The circuitry in that kind of setup is a little different than these simple plugs when transmitting power, so make sure you only use a USB A to C type cable, lest you drive yourself insane trying to debug your circuit. I may have forgotten about that requirement for about 30 minutes at one point, and was pulling my hair out trying to figure out why my dead simple circuit wasn't powering on. After soldering all the wires and the switch together, we can glue everything together, fitting the pieces in place and fusing them with thin super glue. Now we can do a last little touch up of the candles. It's best to do this with the lights on to check for any spots the primer may have missed where the light is leaking through just a little too much. I did actually decide to redo the window paper a little more precisely, as the first round was definitely experimental and wound up just a little bit rough. Finally, we can use a little bit of plasticard, cut to shape to reflect and diffuse the light of the LEDs from the back just a little bit more. This step is optional, but I think it adds a nice touch. And with a coat of Musso Black on the edges of the diorama, it's ready. And there we go, our own little spa day, perfect for the bookshelf. I'd love to have a bathtub like this someday, but until then, this will do pretty well. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I spent some extra time cleaning up the files a bit and making them easier to print. If you'd like to make your own version of this, feel free to grab the files from the link below. And if that's something you'd like to see more of in the future, let me know. Despite all my issues with misscaled prints, slow curing resin, and various wiring glitches, I actually had a lot of fun trying to turn this into something that other people could build. It added an interesting layer of challenge. I might have to try it again at some point. But until then, I hope you have a lovely week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time here on Witch Cove Crafts.